Out of the burning darkness, a 14-year-old boy, a dangerous coal mine, and a horrific accident that would change America forever. And then it accompanies in a picture and this little caption, sunshine. Miners attached small oil lamps, like the one above, to their hats. These lamps provided light in dark underground tunnels. Miners called this light their sunshine. These lamps were dangerous. The open flames could trigger explosions. So what does this picture and title tell us about what the story is going to be about? I think it kind of shows like a young boy. It said 14, and he looks dirty, so maybe how dangerous the mine can be, and we'll learn that. 14-year-old Albert Buckle was staring at death itself. Thick smoke billowed toward him. Flames licked at the ceiling. With each passing second, the heat grew more unbearable. But Albert couldn't run from the roaring fire. He was trapped, deep underground in the coal mine where he worked. As the inferno blazed hotter, people were starting to panic. "Everyone is going to die!" someone shouted. It was November 13th, 1909, at the Cherry Mine, a coal mine about 100 miles southwest of Chicago, Illinois. The Cherry Mine is where Albert and nearly 500 other miners spent their days, hundreds of feet underground, digging out coal from deep inside the earth. But today, disaster had struck. Albert and the other miners were caught in the middle of one of the most devastating coal mine fires in American history. Bright and brisk. Just a few hours earlier, the day had dawned bright and brisk in the small town of Cherry. Albert, his 16-year-old older brother Richard, and 478 other coal miners pulled on their overalls, grabbed their lunch pails, and said goodbye to their families. Then they headed off for what they thought would be an ordinary day at Cherry Mine. Around 6:30 a.m., a whistle blared, signaling that it was time to start work. To enter the mine, Albert crowded into a small metal cage with a group of other miners. The cage was then lowered down a shaft, kind of like an elevator. There were two air shafts at the Cherry Mine. They were the only ways to get in and out of the mine. After a 30-second drop into a pitch blackness, the cage clanked into a stop 317 feet below the surface, and the miners stepped out into the damp, cold air. They had arrived in the Cherry Mine. Like a vast underground city, the mine had 3 main levels from which a maze of tunnels and passageways extended for miles. Dangers at the Cherry Mine, as in any coal mine at the time, were everywhere. Cave-ins were constant threats. So were the underground gases that could kill a person in minutes. Perhaps most terrifying of all was the risk of explosions and fires. But Albert probably didn't spend much time thinking about the many ways a coal miner could be killed. Instead, he probably focused on the pay, which was higher than what he would have earned working on a farm or in a factory. Besides, the Cherry Mine was new. Many said it was the safest mine in America, that it was basically fireproof. As Albert would soon find out, that could have not been more wrong. Transforming America. Coal is a rock-like substance from the ground. It is a fossil fuel, like oil and gas. When you burn coal, heat and energy are released. By the time Albert was born, coal was changing the lives of millions of Americans. Indeed, Albert was growing up in a period of great technological change known as the Industrial Revolution, and coal was powered behind it. Coal was fueling the trains speeding across America, making it possible to travel faster than ever before. Coal was powering the giant new ships churning across the ocean, and coal was being used in factories to make the iron and steel needed to build America's bridges and skyscrapers. During this time, thousands of coal mines were blasted into the ground, especially in Illinois, Kentucky, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. This is where vast deposits of coal had been discovered. Some of these mines were 1,200 feet underground. as deep as the Empire State Building is tall. People came from all over the United States to work in these mines. They also came from across the Atlantic Ocean, from Italy, Ireland, and Eastern Europe. Down in the cherry mine, Albert would have heard at least 10 languages spoken. But America's love of coal had a dark side. Using coal creates pollution, poisoning rivers, and filling the air with toxins. By the end of the 19th century, a stomach-churning brew of soot and grime hung over the many American cities. Today we know that burning coal also contributes to climate change. Difficult and dangerous. Mining coal was a tough and dirty job, as Albert knew well. Day after day, miners blasted through rocks with dynamite. They cut out the coal with heavy tools, their backs aching. They shoveled the coal into cars that looked like giant metal buckets. Then they used mules to pull the coal cars along metal tracks, like the tracks of a roller coaster, to the air shaft. From there, the coal was hoisted up the shaft to the surface. And it wasn't just grown men who toiled in the mines. In the early 1900s, thousands of children, like Albert, did too, some as young as 8 years old. Since 1885, the United States government had required children to be at least 12 to work in a mine, but those laws were often ignored. It might be hard to imagine why parents would let their kids work in dangerous mines, but many families were so poor that they faced a terrible choice: send their children to work or watch them starve. In fact, Albert and Richard likely felt proud to work at the mine. Their father had died a few years earlier, and it was up to them to help support their mother and little sister. Lonely and boring. Around 11:30 a.m., Albert finished eating his lunch with his brother and headed back to work. As a trapper, Albert's job was to sit by a door and open it only to let miners and mules pass through. The door was part of the mine's ventilation system, which kept fresh air in the places where people were working. This also prevented the buildup of dangerous gases. A trapper's job was important but boring. Imagine sitting alone, in the dark, all day, every day, just opening and closing a door. Sometimes you might not see another person for hours, but you couldn't fall asleep. If your mule team came speeding along and you didn't open the door, they could crash, crushing the mules, the driver, and maybe even you. What was Albert thinking about that November morning as he sat alone guarding the door? Was he looking forward to the next day? It would be Sunday, his only day off. Whatever his thoughts were, they would soon vanish. Catastrophe was coming. Scorching heat. Not long after lunch, Albert opened the door for a car filled with hay, food for the mules. A few moments later, another miner came running up to Albert. "Fire!" he shouted. Somehow, oil from a lamp had dripped onto the hay car, setting the hay on fire. Albert rushed to fetch a pail of water. Still, he probably didn't fear for his safety. Small fires could usually be put out without much trouble. But by the time Albert returned, it was clear that this fire was different. The smoke was already thick. He tossed his pail of water onto the blaze. It did nothing. Worse, the hay car was stuck under the air shaft. The fresh air was fanning the flames. Albert needed to get out. He and a few others rushed for the shaft to take a cage to the surface, but the cage operator stopped them. He said the fire would be soon out and they could get back to work. But as the minutes passed, the fire got bigger and hotter, and so soon the mine itself was on fire. Only then did the call go out to evacuate the mine. As Albert finally climbed into the cage, he called to a friend to warn others, including his brother, Richard. Hundreds of men were scattered throughout the tunnels. Brutal decision. When Albert finally made it up to the surface, he came upon a scene of panic. Smoke was gushing up out of the mine. Women and children were rushing to the scene, desperate to find their husbands and sons and brothers. Meanwhile, down below, miners were scrambling to get out, only to find tunnels blocked by flames, mules, and coal cars. Over the next few hours, more than 200 men and boys would escape. One brave group began taking the cage up and down, plucking their fellow miners from the flames. They made 6 trips and rescued dozens of men before they died, heroically in the fire. Around 4 p.m., mine company leaders made a brutal decision to seal off the air shaft. This would choke the fire out. They hoped. Fires need oxygen to keep burning. To many, this decision was a terrible act of cruelty. Without fresh air flowing, anyone still alive wouldn't last long. Many said the mine company cared more about its coal than the human beings. When the sun set that day, the fire showed little signs of slowing down. More than 200 miners were still trapped. In the coming days, the fire would continue to burn. More than 1,000 people descended on Cherry to help. Donations poured in. The disaster was front-page news across the country. On November 20th, a week after the fire started, the rescue crews managed to enter the mine at last. The only survivors were a group of 20 men who had found a pocket of breathable airway from the fire. Tragically, 259 miners died in the disaster. Albert's brother Richard was one of them. New laws. Today, this disaster has been largely forgotten, yet it helped bring important change. After the fire, the public was outraged. People rallied to help survivors and the families of the victims. A massive investigation was also launched, and Albert himself testified. The mine company was fined for illegally employing underage kids. Over the next few years, new safety rules were created. The changes helped lead to some of the laws we have today that protect workers. The Cherry Mine disaster also showed the sad situation of child workers. It helped fuel a movement that in 1938 banned child labor in the United States at last. As for Albert, his days working in a coal mine were over. He eventually moved to a nearby town and became a tree trimmer. Albert would spend the rest of his days not in the darkness of the earth, but in the light of the sky. Okay, so now going over the questions for exploring text features. Number 1, study the headline, subhead, and image on pages 4 through 5. How do these text features help you get interested in the article? So you turn back to pages 4 and 5, which is the beginning of the article, and it's talking about the title, Out of Burning Darkness. That little subheading, which says, a 14-year-old boy, a dangerous coal mine, and a horrific accident that would change America forever. And the picture, which is of the boy with his oil lamp on his head. How do these 3 things help you get interested? How does it make you want to read the story? That's what this question's asking you. Question number 2. How does What is Coal box on page 6 help you understand the rest of the article? So you turn to page 6, and it's talking about this box right here, What is Coal? The story of coal begins long before Albert was born. It begins before Illinois was a state. It begins before human beings existed. Hundreds of millions of years ago, parts of the earth were covered with hot, swampy forests. The plants in these forests soaked up energy from the sun. After they died, the plants were slowly crushed over millions and millions of years, eventually becoming coal. When you burn coal, all the energy those ancient plants took in from the sun is released. So question 2 is asking, how does this information help you understand the rest of the article? Question number 3. Review the section headings on page 7. What do they suggest about the conditions coal miners faced in the early 1900s? So section headings is another word for subheadings or subtitles. So in this instance, we turn to page 7, and it's talking about difficult and dangerous, and lonely and boring. So how do these 2 subheadings or section headings help you understand what the conditions were in the mines? Question number 4. Look at the image in the caption on page 8. What was the purpose of bringing canaries into the coal mines? What else does this caption explain? So we turn to page 8, And it's talking about this circle with the canary bird in it. Canary in the coal mine. Miners often brought canaries into coal mines. If lethal gases were present, the gas would kill the canary before the miners, giving them enough time to get out. Today, a canary in the coal mine means warning of danger. So what was the purpose of bringing the canaries into the coal mine? And what else did this caption explain besides just what the canary did? Question 5. Look at the image and caption on page 9. Based on this information, how is the coal mining different today than it was when Albert was a miner? So going into page 9, coal mining today. Today, the U.S. relies on less coal than it did in the past, but coal remains a big source of energy in America and around the world. Modern safety rules and new technology have made mines much safer, but coal mining is still dangerous. Over the past decade, 228 miners were killed in coal mining accidents in the United States, according to the Mine Safety and Health Administration. So, how has mining today changed from mining back when Albert was a miner? And then the last question. Review the sidebar Children of the Coal Mines on page 6 through 8. Which mining job would you like to do least and why? So starting on page 6, Children of the Coal Mines. These were some of the jobs that kids had. Mule drivers. Mule drivers led the mules that pulled cars full of coal through the mines. Mule driving was often the job that kids wanted most. And then on page 7, you had trapper. A trapper opened and shut doors to let mules and coal cars through. These doors were part of the mine's ventilation system. The doors kept fresh air in and bad air out. And turning the page to page 8, breaker boy. Outside the mine was a large, noisy building called a breaker. This is where coal was broken up and sorted by big machines. Some mines also employed breaker boys. Their job was to pick out small pieces of rock from the precious coal. They sat hunched over for hours, their fingers often frozen and bloody. So, out of these 3 jobs that they talked about, which one would you least like, which one do you not want, and why?